First one is for the statisticians, the empirically minded. Who are they? Second part of the talk is for the theoreticians, so what are the reasons they're leaving? The third, and I hope most important part of the talk, is for all of us practitioners. What do we do? How do we solve this problem? Okay, so first of all, who are the unaffiliated? You know, a bit of good news is we have actually a lot of data on this. This issue has been studied a lot in recent years, and let me share some of these statistics with you. Here's one that I find really illuminating. Go back to the early 1970s, so when I was a little kid. Studies showed that about 3% of the country would have said in the early 70s that they have no religion. So 97% of our country would have claimed some religious affiliation. Now, I'm not saying they were all saints. I'm not saying they were all, practicing their faith beautifully, but 97% of the country would have claimed some religious identity. Now, fast forward to the year 1991. It's like 20 years later. The figure has gone up 100% to 6%. So it's an increase to be sure, but still in absolute numbers, not an extraordinary increase. Still 94% of our country would have claimed in 1991 that they have a religious identity. But then go from 91 until today, and you see an extraordinary increase. Today, the figure is 26%. 26% of our country now claims to be a nun, to be unaffiliated, no religious identity. Over a quarter of the country, so somewhere around 80 million people in our country would now say they have no religion. And I'm old enough, maybe some of you listening are old enough to remember what it was like in the early 70s. There was something different, I think, in the social fabric. When you had a country that still was largely religious, many more practicing than do today. Things have changed. And then when you look at younger people, the numbers get even more disturbing. Look now at people under 30, that number rises from 26% to 40%. 40% of Americans under 30 would now claim no religion. And, dare I say it, looking at young Catholics, it gets worse still. Catholics 30 and younger, the number rises to 50%. Now, let that sink in a little bit, everybody. So we're all committed to the Catholic Church and Catholic education and sacraments and everything. Fully 1/2 of young Catholics have now disaffiliated. Not encouraging number. Here's a stat that stays in my mind. It's quite telling. For every one person today joining the Catholic Church, 6 are leaving. And by the way, that's the worst ratio of all the major religions. So think of, as you see people with great joy coming to the church at Easter time. For every one that joins, roughly 6 are leaving. Another disturbing statistic, read the work of Jean Twenge. She's a sociologist at the University of San Diego. Wrote a really interesting book called iGen, meaning the generation that's raised on iPads and iPhones, right? The youngest set. She has a chapter on religion, and it's worth reading because she says there was an old nostrum that said, well, sure, a lot of young people disaffiliate from, official religion, but they remain spiritual, meaning, belief in God, belief in an afterlife, belief in, fundamental objective morality, etc. She's showing, and I'm not surprised, that nostrum is now exposed as false because the longer people stay away from institutional and formal religion, the less connected to the spiritual they are. So they're both less religious and less spiritual. Here's just one more. Read Christian Smith from the University of Notre Dame. He's one of the most, I think, insightful commenters on this whole situation. Most young Catholics, both affiliated and unaffiliated, will say something like this. I'm going to give a quote, but it's very representative. I'm so okay with uncertainty. I think uncertainty is beautiful. I think the most beautiful works of art are the ones that lead you to asking questions as opposed to those trying to supply answers to what something is. My point here is the number of people among the young who are into the quest, not into the answers provided by classical religion. Here's a last quote, and it's from my colleague at Word on Fire, Brandon Vaught. By the way, one of the more insightful commenters on this situation. Brandon said, let's face it, the church is hemorrhaging young people. And I think the stats certainly bear that out. Okay, that's a little overview of some of the statistics on who are the nuns, who are those who are disaffiliating. So, second question, how come they're leaving? Now, something I find is interesting, when you bring up this question, and I talk about this a lot on my online ministry, everyone's got an answer. Everyone has got a response. There's a lot of pontificating around this question. I know why they're leaving. Here's why they're leaving. Well, and they're usually in complete contradiction with each other, all these different pontifications. The good news is, again, there's a lot of objective data around this. We don't just have to rely on people's, gut feelings and anecdotal stories. There's a lot of objective data, a lot of studies in which young people are asked the specific and blunt question, well, how come you left? And they tell us. And so I think it's best to stay with the objective data and not just with our kind of private opinions. Let me draw your attention to two pretty recent Pew Forum studies that are very indicative. So I'm just citing two here, but it's very typical of the surveys done over the past many years. When asked in the survey why they left, a 2016 Pew Forum study, fully 50% of the respondents said, lack of belief in religious teachings. So they were given a number of options, like, here's 7 things, check them off, why you left. Fully 50%, by far the highest, lack of belief in religious teachings. In a 2018 Pew Forum study, same question asked, it now rose to 60%. Checked off, I just don't believe the teachings of the religion. Here's a first observation, everybody. I find when talking about this issue, almost everybody reaches for a kind of behavioral explanation. I think young people leave because they were, mistreated. They had a bad experience at Mass. Maybe they're leaving because of the sex abuse scandals and all that. And indeed, I'll get there. They do figure in these surveys. But clearly, across many years now, the number one reason given is a more intellectual reason. They just are not getting their questions answered. They just don't believe what religion is teaching. And this comes through in all the surveys. It's often tightly correlated to the conflict between religion and science. See, because in the minds of many young people today, science, the physical sciences, the hard sciences, that's the model of real knowledge. Well, religion seems out of step with science, and if there's a conflict, guess which one's going to win in the minds of young people? So the irrationality of religion, at least in their minds, is a major reason. Here's something from Christian Smith, again, the Notre Dame researcher. He said 59% of the young disaffiliated that he studied agree with the statement that religion and science are in conflict with each other. Again, in their minds, which one's going to win? Trust me, it's not going to be religion. We'll get there when I start talking about how to address this thing, but this should be, I think, uppermost in our minds. Our young people are having a hard time getting their minds around religion, and science and religion conflict is one of the issues. Here's just a quote from some of Christian Smith's research. This is from a young disaffiliated person. Now I wonder if God even exists. I believe God was once used to explain phenomena which are now explained by science. That's a young man. Here's now one from a young woman. In all honesty, I feel religion is a somewhat outdated notion. And now that we have such scientific advances, we no longer need a higher being to explain how we came to be. I now put my faith in science. Again, very, very typical among young people. Okay, another reason why they disaffiliate, religion in the minds of the young seems to be associated with violence. Now keep in mind, we're living in the, post 9/11 period. 9/11 stirred up a very old argument coming up out of the Enlightenment. Namely, since religion is irrational, the only way religious people can adjudicate their disputes is through violence. I mean, is that a fair assessment of all of religion? Of course not, but it gets deep into people's minds, especially in the wake of something like 9/11. By the way, it's no accident that the new atheists, think of Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris, who, by the way, have had a massive impact on young people. I hear their rhetoric all the time. The new atheist emerged, it's no accident, right in the wake of 9/11, because it stirred up this old idea about religion and violence. Here's a third reason for disaffiliation. The conflict between the claims of religion and what I call the culture of self-invention. The culture of self-invention. Now, you know what this means. All you got to do is watch the news, listen to music, go to any movie, talk to most young people, because it's the default position, I think, of most high school students and college students in America. Namely, it's my prerogative to invent my life, to define my values, to define my identity. My freedom determines who I am. Which, is a very practical translation of Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. When Sartre defined existentialism, he said, well, it's the view that existence precedes essence. For him, that meant my freedom comes first, and then my freedom determines who I am. Existence precedes essence. Sounds like highfalutin, French philosophy. Well, it was in 1947. Now it's the default position of most young people. The culture of self-invention. Well, it does stand athwart religion, which makes very objective claims about what's true and what's morally right. And that sets up a conflict with young people. Now, as I mentioned, you do indeed find in these surveys references to, I was treated poorly by church, ministers or by priests or by parishioners. Here's one that kind of broke my heart. I remember when I first read it. Someone said, I left my Catholic church and no one ever called me. No one ever inquired how I was doing. No one from the church ever reached out to say, hey, we haven't seen you. So you do indeed hear that a lack of welcome in the community, being treated poorly. And then indeed, I'm not trying to under stress this. It's just not the number one reason by any means, but it's there. The scandals. Almost my whole priesthood's been under the shadow of the sex abuse scandals. So I know all about that. And young people, they know all about that. It's gotten deep into their minds and hearts, and that is indeed a block, no question about it. I've referred to the sex abuse scandal as the devil's masterpiece because it's undermined the church in practically every way, including this, including our capacity to reach out and engage young people. So that is indeed a reason. And then finally, I'll say this, survey after survey, the church's teaching on matters sexual is a block for a lot of those who have disaffiliated. Now, if you look at older disaffiliated Catholics, it's almost always the issue of divorce and remarriage. It's interesting to me, the synod that produced Amoris Laetitia, 2016, I guess that was, and the issue of divorce and remarriage and communion and so on, that's very much the sort of prime sexual concern of an older generation of Catholics, Pope Francis' generation. Now, as you get younger, what comes into focus is the question of gays, that the church is at least seems to be cruel and exclusive toward gay people. Now, get even younger, get down to the iGen generation. it becomes the issue of transgenderism. So that's true. As you look at these surveys, people will say the church's attitude toward human sexuality is unrealistic, or it's exclusive, or it's cruel. So those are indeed present. Okay, so we know statistically, who the disaffiliated are. We know their numbers. And we can tell from these surveys. I've just gone through a few of them. But some of the main reasons why they've chosen to disaffiliate. I think as we push forward in different ways, it's just wise to be aware of these objective data, so we don't just go on our kind of gut feelings about it. Okay, I went a little bit quickly through those first two questions because I think this last one is the most important, and I want to spend the most time with it. Namely, how do we get them back? Or if I might suggest, this thing cuts in both directions. How do we get them back? But also, how do we prevent them from becoming nuns in the first place? Right? How do we interrupt this tendency toward disaffiliation? So all the answers here are meant to cut in really both those directions. And maybe, I say this now as a pastor, it's that second one that's maybe more important. How do we keep young people from wandering away from us? Okay, so I'm going to suggest 5 things. There are many more things we could say, but I'll just suggest 5. And these 2, mind you, are based on a lot of statistical surveys. As you listen to young people and say, well, what do you remember fondly? Or what would bring you back? It'll be reflected now in some of the answers I give here. Here's the first one. Get young people involved in the works of justice. Get young people involved in the works of justice. So, as I said, there's a lot of hesitation when it comes to the church's sexual teaching. I am not arguing that we should jettison our sexual teaching, not at all. But I don't think when trying to reach out to the disaffiliated, it's wise to begin with the sexual teaching. It's what they find problematic. But they will say in survey after survey, what I remember fondly or what I feel passionately about is the church's commitment to social justice. They find that very attractive. Well, it's a great part of our Catholic tradition. We have a beautiful tradition around doing the works of justice, stretching all the way back to the first years of the church's life, when precisely by its moral profile it stood out against the environing culture. How these Christians love one another. Tertullian's famous line, reporting what the pagans were saying. The fact that Christians wouldn't expose their infant children on the mountainside if they were unwanted. The fact that Christians included the poor and the hungry and the homeless. That was a deeply attractive evangelical element from the earliest centuries. And then look at this litany we have, this cloud of witnesses. Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, Jacques Maritain, Reynold Hillenbrand, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, Rose Hawthorne. Not to mention Francis of Assisi, Vincent de Paul, Peter Claver, Martin de Porres, Bartolomé de las Casas. We have a wonderful, wonderful history and tradition around justice and the works of justice. Well, highlight it, announce it, boldly proclaim it, bring these people forward. Young people find it very enticing. Good, we should use it. And even more importantly, get them involved. I deal a lot with our confirmation prep programs. I confirm all these kids out here, and I love talking to the teams that prepare them. I talk to the kids themselves. And again, they'll talk about having that experience of going down and serving the homeless, working in the soup kitchen, going over to Catholic Charities and feeding the hungry. Of course they do. Of course they do. It gets deep in their souls. Get them involved. I love this story. It's from the ancient church, the great church father Origen. A young man named Gregory came to Origen and said, "I'd like you to teach me the Christian faith." Origen said, "First come and live our life, and then you'll learn our faith from the inside." Very good advice. And that young man, Gregory, is now known in the tradition as Gregory Thaumaturgus, Gregory the Wonder Worker. He himself became a saint. That's often how it works. Come join our life, see how we live, see our commitments. And that has an evangelical power. Or this from Jared Manley Hopkins, the great Jesuit poet. Appropriate now at the beginning of Lent to tell the story because a young struggling seeker came to him and said, "I'm just having trouble believing in God." And Hopkins said, "Give alms." He didn't give him an argument. He didn't give him theology or philosophy. He said, "Give alms." There's something about participating in the works of justice, concrete care for the poor, that has an evangelizing power. It always has, still does. I want to just give you a couple quotes here, still under this rubric. I'm quoting here from a guy named Stephen Bullivant, who's a wonderful researcher over in England, has looked very carefully at this issue of disaffiliation. I'm quoting here from people who have left the church, but are recalling what they still savor. Listen. "I admire the fact that the Catholic Church is the biggest provider of health and education after governments in the world." That's from a lady, 64, who disaffiliated. Another lady says, "The church has soft power. Its reach is virtually ubiquitous, and I believe this could be important in various ways. For example, monitoring modern slavery. It also contributes greatly to education and health worldwide. It's so good for charity." Mind you, it's a disaffiliated person speaking, but she's still savoring this element of the church's life. And there are many more quotes I can give you. But that's my first recommendation, is start with justice. I don't think, especially wagging fingers around sexual matters, is a good place to start. Again, I'm not saying we get rid of it, but I wouldn't recommend starting with that. Okay, second recommendation. Use what Pope Francis calls the via pulchritudinis, Latin for the way of beauty. Now, I've been on this theme for a while. In fact, I had the privilege just a year ago, right before COVID hit, the California bishops were over in Rome for the Ad Limina visit, and we had 3 hours with Pope Francis, and he said, basically, ask me anything. And so I kind of screwed up my courage, and I actually asked him a question in Spanish. And I asked him about this, about the way of beauty. And he spoke very beautifully about it. Here's my conviction. In our postmodern culture, when there is such skepticism about the true and the good, right? If you say, well, here's what's true, you better believe it. Well, all the defenses go up. Or worse yet, if you say, well, here's the way you ought to be behaving. Oh, people get defensive. Okay, well, try the third transcendental, right? The good, the true, and the beautiful. Try the beautiful. Just show the Sistine Chapel. Show Chartres Cathedral. Show someone how to read Brideshead Revisited, how to read the stories of Flannery O'Connor, how to read the poetry of T.S. Eliot. Show them the beautiful. It's not as threatening immediately. And it draws people in. And again, everybody, we've got a great tradition around justice. We've also got a wonderful tradition around beauty. It's the glory of Catholicism. Where Protestantism did go through a kind of iconoclastic period. When you go back to Luther and the other reformers, they got rid of a lot of beauty. To me, that's always a sign of corruption. The church, the Catholic Church, has hung on to the beautiful as a bearer of evangelical power. And so we have art and architecture and poetry and music. Learn it, love it, savor it, and learn how to communicate that powerfully to young people. I think here of Cardinal Martini, who died, about 10 or 15 years ago now. He was the Archbishop of Milan. He himself was a Bible scholar. But he took advantage of, I don't know if you've been there, it's one of the great sites in all of Europe, the great cathedral in Milan. And he would gather young people in the plaza in front, and he would give a talk on the Bible. But part of the power of that was he just gathered them in this gorgeous space, looking up at the facade of one of the most magnificent cathedrals. Or I think of one of my heroes, Cardinal Lustiger of Paris. He was cardinal when I was a student in Paris. His mother died in the Shoah. He was from a Jewish family and was, for his own protection, given to a Catholic family during the war. And during that period, this young Jewish boy wandered into a cathedral, and he was converted. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't theology, though he became a great theological mind. It was the beauty of the cathedral. It changed his heart. I mean, I totally get that. Listen now to a few quotes from Stephen Bullivant's studies. Again, these are people who have disaffiliated, but they're remembering what they savored. Here's a man in his 60s. The Catholic Church has been a major cultural force in European history. It has at times supplied a necessary spiritual discipline. I can respect it for that. Here's a young man in his 20s who disaffiliated. I find attractive the history of the church, our roots in the Middle East, our diversity in the world of fine arts and music. Another young man in his 20s, disaffiliated, but said, I love the fine artistic and liturgical tradition of the church. Just one more, this is not from a young woman. I love Catholic theology, liturgy, devotion, art, and music. Mind you, she's left the church, but she's still, it's like echoing in her soul, the beauty of the church. Use it, learn it, share it, know how to read these great texts, know how to read a great cathedral. I think our young people will be enthralled by the beauty of our church. Okay, third recommendation. So justice, beauty. And the third one, you probably can guess this from if you've been following my work at all over the years, if you paid attention to what I said is clearly the number one reason why young people are disaffiliating, clearly number one, I don't believe these teachings, science and religion, all that. So my third recommendation is stop dumbing down our faith. I know I've been banging podiums for years on this, and maybe I become tiresome, but I don't care. I think it's such an important theme. Intellectual objections are paramount in the minds of young nuns, of those who are disaffiliating. They're not getting their questions answered. And they are being evangelized very effectively by atheists in our culture, who are giving them arguments. They're not hugging them into atheism, they're arguing them into atheism. And we've got this brilliantly illuminating intellectual tradition. But I'm not blaming Vatican II. Vatican II is produced by the smartest people in the 20th century, Catholicism. But in the wake of the council, we entered into a program of dumbing down the faith. And you know it. You know it. We now had about 2-3 generations. In the name, I guess, of relevance or whatever, we dumb down the faith. We de-emphasize the intellectual dimension. And it has been a pastoral disaster. And you can see it, everybody, in the armies of the disaffiliated, who claim that they do not have intellectual reasons for believing our faith. I'm not reducing everything to the mind. You just heard me talk about justice and beauty. So I'm not saying it's all about apologetics or about arguments, but by God, it is about intellectualism, at least to a strong degree. Something I found in my years of pastoral work, Chicago and here and elsewhere, I think we tend to be pretty good when we form our kids in prayer and spirituality. I think we tend to be pretty good when it comes to the works of justice and getting them, aware of the needs of the poor. All terrific. But I don't think we're particularly good at the intellectual dimension, and it shows in the disaffiliation of many of our young people. I'm not cast. I'm blaming all of us. Bishops, priests, catechists, teachers. I mean, all of us, I think, have to bear some of this responsibility, and we all got to collectively pick up our game. Now, here's some good news on this front. Precisely because of the new atheists, there's been a sort of renaissance in Catholic apologetics. There's a lot of good material now, both in book form and video form, a lot in social media, on the internet, that will help us answer the questions that people have. So take advantage of it. I mean, learn it. I can give you good recommendations, teachers out there and catechists, to help your kids deal with the objections that come from the wider culture. So that's some good news. But, gosh, I think we so underestimate what our young people are capable of. I mean, I've told this story a number of times, so if you've heard it, I apologize. But this is many years ago now, when my niece was starting her senior year in high school at a well-known Catholic high school outside Chicago. And my brother said, well, there's her books on the table. So I went over, and she had Virgil in Latin for her Latin class. She had Shakespeare, they're reading Hamlet, I think it was, for English class. She had Einstein or some complex, physicist for science class. And then in religion, she had this little paperback with a big picture on the cover, this simple, and that's her religion book. So I said, what is the problem here? Why is this young lady reading Shakespeare in English and Virgil in Latin and Einstein in science, and she's reading a comic book in religion? Why aren't we giving her Thomas Aquinas, G.K. Chesterton, Bonaventure, Augustine, Anyway, end of a harangue. But this theme, everybody, it's not just my little private hang-up. It's in the data. It's in the data that a dumbed-down Catholicism has resulted in disaffiliation. So we got to pick up our game. But we have resources. That's the good news. There are resources now. But, for all of us to learn our great intellectual tradition, learn all those names I just mentioned, and then share it with our kids is just hugely important. Okay, just a couple more, because I know I'm close to running out of time. Here's my fourth. Let me say this. So I mentioned justice, beauty, and life of the mind. I did the three transcendentals, right? Justice, the good, the way of beauty, the beautiful, and then the intellectual, the true. The good, the true, and the beautiful. Use the three transcendentals in reaching out to our young kids. Okay, but here's the fourth recommendation I have. Turn every parish into a missionary society. Go right back to Vatican II, everyone. There's a clear line, Vatican II to Francis and all the popes in between. The great impulse behind Vatican II was a missionary impulse. My mentor, Cardinal George of Chicago, always said that. He said the key to Vatican II is to read it as a missionary council. It wasn't like Trent or Nicaea or Chalcedon trying to settle complex matters of doctrine. That wasn't its main purpose. Its purpose was now to get the church out from itself and out into the world, to let out the life. Now that's the new evangelization articulated by Paul VI, now St. Paul VI, St. John Paul II. Benedict, Francis, of course. Read Evangelii Gaudium as I think the master text of Pope Francis' pontificate. They're all about the same thing, which is a church that goes out from itself in a missionary spirit. I think, though, and this is, again, Pope Francis is real strong on this, we have a tendency to stay within ourselves. I'm a good Catholic if I go to Mass and I receive the sacraments, and maybe I go to a program occasionally and I take in some formation, and I'm a good Catholic. Well, all that's, of course, terrific, but as de Lubac said, after the words of consecration, the most sacred words of the Mass are go. The Mass is ended. Go and love and serve the Lord. Go proclaim I can never get it right unless I'm standing at the altar. Go in peace, glorifying the Lord by your life. The whole idea is it's an outward thrusting move. evangelize. What are our parishes? Are they places where we kind of gather to hunker down, or are they mission societies? Places where people are being formed to announce the gospel now to the wider world. Unless and until they become that, we're not realizing, it seems to me, the dream of Vatican II. Are we satisfied, Catholics, that this is pre-COVID? Pre-COVID, 20% maybe of Catholics go to Mass on Sunday. 20%. If you would ask the fathers of Vatican II, at the time of Vatican II, something like 60 or 65% of Catholics in our country were going to Mass. Well, and they thought that was bad. They wanted a revolution. They wanted to now intensify our liturgical lives. If you told them in the year 2021 only 20% are going to Mass, we shouldn't be satisfied with that. No, our job now, having been to Mass, now we go and bring people in. Come on, bring somebody back. The priests can't do it all. Bishops can't do it all. I mean, it's up now to the faithful. That's how you're sanctified, by bringing others to sanctification. Turn every parish into a missionary society. You know, the great megachurch Protestant, Rick Warren, whom I met a couple years ago out here in California. And I'd read him before, but I'd never met him and enjoyed talking to him. And one thing he told me that stayed in my mind was, he said, everyone knows me as, friendly Pastor Rick. I got my Hawaiian shirt, I'm not putting on any airs. And he said, all that's designed to bring people in. He wants to attract them to his church. Good. But then he said, what people don't realize is, once they're in, I make demands on them. He said, they got to go through a whole discipleship training program. If they don't, they're out. Once they've been trained as disciples, now they're sent on mission. They don't want to go on mission, they're out. In other words, he's demanding that they now become trained missionaries. I just wonder how many of us Catholics think along those lines, because we should. We should. That's the Vatican II vision. Having been sanctified, having been Christified at Mass, now go and Christify the world. I like that line that says, when you walk out the door of any church in the United States, you have entered mission country. It's true, isn't it? I mean, you don't need to go to Africa or to Asia for mission country. It's right outside the door of your church every time you leave Mass. Do we see our parishes as training centers precisely for evangelists, missionaries, and disciples? Now, again, we could do a whole talk on that. That would be a good focus for another 45-minute talk. What would that look like? But start thinking about it. You and the pastor together, you and your friends in the parish, start thinking about that. What would that look like if we were a missionary society? Okay, here's a fifth and final recommendation. We have to be digital missionaries if we want to reach young people. Let me take you back to 2018. I had the privilege of being a delegate at the Synod on Young People, gathering of bishops from all over the world with the Pope every day. It was a marvelous experience. It was a whole month in Rome with the Pope practically every day. Listening to talks from the bishops. Then we had smaller, language group sessions, and all around this question, really, of young people and how to re-engage them. Well, I listened for a couple weeks, and what struck me was all these very good people, but they were talking almost exclusively about what I'd call parish programs. How can we make our parishes a better place where the young people can be instructed? Or how can we have a program that will bring young people in? So finally, I stood up at the Synod and I said, I think this is the wrong way to think about it. We have armies of the disaffiliated, so we know that. They're not likely to come to our parishes. I mean, years ago, that was true. We kind of assumed Catholics would come to be evangelized at our institutions, at our schools and parishes and seminaries, but they're not. We've got to go get them. We've got to go out from our churches to get them. But I said, the good news is, precisely when we're experiencing this crisis of disaffiliation, we've also been given, through God's providence, the means to reach people who have disaffiliated. And I mean here the social media. And I've said before, it's a revolution as remarkable as the Gutenberg Revolution, I think. It's comparable to that. The way it's changed and enhanced our capacity for communication. Precisely when they're not coming to us, we can go out to them through these social media. And let's face it, you know this. I mean, the vast majority of people 30 and under, they live on the internet. That's where they live. And so we've got to invade that space creatively, and we can now through the social media. I've had a fair amount of experience with this because of my Word on Fire ministry, which began really as an experiment. I knew I wanted to evangelize. I had an instinct that we could go beyond the classical kind of radio and television approach, that we could start using these new media. But when I started, in the early 2000s, these things were in their kind of incipient stage. I remember YouTube came into being in 2006, and it was February 2007 that I put out my first commentary on YouTube. Well, I mean, I didn't know. I had no idea who was watching. I didn't understand that world well at all. And I was thrilled when 300 people would watch one of my videos. My point is, we just kind of started small. And my instinct was, don't begin with, finger wagging, or don't begin with, moral correction. It's likely not going to work well with young people. But rather begin by looking out at the culture and finding what the church fathers called semina verbi, right? Seeds of the word. There's going to be something in that film or in that book or in that news event or something going on in the culture that is redolent of the gospel. There's something of the gospel there. And if you can see it and point it out, it might be a way of drawing people in. Well, again, it was an experiment. I was just, kind of hoping against hope it might work. And the amazing thing is, I think it has, over the years, had that effect. I got, so many stories I could tell about people that, look, Father, Bishop, I was an atheist, I'm an agnostic, I would never think of coming to church, but I stumbled on your video. And they call it the sticky quality of the internet, that you start here, but it links to here, to here, to here, to here. And before you know it, you're watching something you never intended to. Well, it happens a lot with the videos that I do. Someone, they like Bob Dylan, and they find out that, I have a video on Bob Dylan. They like the films of Clint Eastwood, and I got this review of one of Clint Eastwood's movies. They like history, and that brings them to some commentary I did on, It works. I think it can work. And I think parishes endeavoring to be missionary societies should get young people who know how to use this world and do it. Do it. They've got this in their fingers. I don't. I didn't grow up with this stuff. I rely on these wonderful younger people at Word on Fire that know how to use all this stuff. But heck, find them. Find young people. And then I've told my brother bishops this. If I were bishop of a diocese, I would try to find some really bright young priest. Send them for doctoral studies, but not to teach in the seminary, not to run my education programs in the diocese. I would send them to get a doctorate and then be my main person for outreach through the social media. Because I'll tell you one thing about it too, is you got to be smart. You got to know what you're talking about. You can't just say, I'm full of goodwill and I want to reach out through the social media. Yeah, but you're going to meet all kinds of questions and issues and objections, and you got to be grounded in the great tradition to respond. Let me give you one example of this. I don't know if you know about this website called Reddit, Reddit. I brought it up at the Youth Synod, I remember, and I brought it up at the USCCB meetings, and some of the older bishops like, what is he talking about? Well, Reddit is like a forum, for discussion of issues. You bring up different matters, everyone jumps on and shares their opinion. It's kind of, rough and tumble. That's one thing, if you want to get involved in the internet world, you got to have some thick skin. People don't just play around on the internet. There's some pretty harsh language being used. Anyway, Reddit has a feature called AMA, which means Ask Me Anything. So I heard about this from one of my Word on Fire people, and he said, why don't you go on and try it? So I did, and I just said, I am a Catholic bishop who loves dialoguing with non-believers and atheists and searchers or something like that, Well, it turns out, I think the first time I did it, I was the third most popular Reddit AMA of that year. And I'm saying it not because, they think I'm so great. They didn't know who I was from Adam, I'm sure. But that I was a Catholic bishop willing to wade into this sort of dangerous space. But enormous reaction. I did it a second time. This is maybe a year ago. I was the second most popular Reddit AMA of the year. And again, not because of me. They didn't know me. But that a Catholic bishop would avail himself of this opportunity. They responded like mad to it, Good. It shows the power of this kind of outreach. And I think we got to be willing and able to do it, And a word to the wise here, because many ask me, for advice about this. Don't give up. Start. So young priests said to me, how do I get going? I said, how about, put your sermons up? How about share some reflections? How about do a movie review or whatever? Start. Only, 100 people watch. So what? That's how I got going. For a long time, 100 or 200 people watched. Don't give up. Okay? Let me bring it to a close. I'm a little bit over time. The last thing, pray. And I don't mean to sound like just a nice, pious guy when I say that. Nothing in the Bible ever happens outside of prayer. It's just indispensable in the spiritual order. The famous story of Monica praying for Augustine over many, many years before he was brought back to the faith. Make this the focus of your Eucharistic adoration in your parishes. Bring it to the liturgy so that it's in the prayers of the faithful. Have groups in your parish that are specifically geared to pray for the disaffiliated. Let people bring forward names of particular people. This is my grandson. This is my daughter. This is my mother. They've disaffiliated. Let's pray for them. So above all these other recommendations, I would put prayer. And don't give up. It's a very serious problem. We need to address it, but we can address it relying on the grace of God. Thanks, everybody. Always good to be with the University Series.
Thank you, Bishop Barron. We have a few questions from the audience for you. Going back to the data and the list of reasons why young people are leaving Catholicism, where on that list is the item of all male clergy?
I must say it doesn't come up that much. The ones I mentioned, I think, are the dominant ones. Certainly you hear concerns about, women priests, et cetera, generally speaking. But I must say in my years of looking at this particular set of data, I don't see that as a major reason for disaffiliation. People will be upset with the institutional church. Usually it means the scandals or it means our sexual teaching. But I don't really see that particular issue in regard to this question.
All right, another question then.
Please.
The nuns are attracted to social justice. Is there a link, you think, an explanation for the increase in attitudes against abortion as part of that?
Yeah, I would certainly see it as a justice issue. And if the church presents it that way, which I think we do, I think it would make perfect sense that the commitment to ending abortion is just part of our social justice outreach.
On the subject of beauty, you mentioned that we have these beautiful churches of the past, the cathedrals. So why are we today building churches that have no style or any kind of art, and they look like poor first-grade attempts?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big issue you're bringing up there. I'm somewhat sympathetic with you. I'm not a big fan of Bauhaus modernism. And we did, in the years I was coming of age, like in the 70s and 80s, we built a lot of churches in that style. And I don't think that style bears the weight of Revelation very well. You look back at, whether it's a Basilica style, Romanesque style, Gothic style, let's say a Victorian Gothic, different forms that I think are able to bear the weight of Revelation better. Now, it's not to say that there's nothing in contemporary, architecture that can do that. I think there are. But I think we got to be sensitive to that issue. It's not like just trying to be trendy and stay up with the times. The church in its art is trying to express its own life in plastic form. And certain forms of architecture bear that better than others, I would say. But if you want details, read someone like Dennis McNamara, who does a lot of work on theology and architecture. But I'm somewhat sympathetic with the concern because there was a tendency when I was a young man to mute the beautiful. And I think it was a somewhat Protestantizing tendency because that is in the Protestant reformers. So they wanted to mute the beautiful. And we were imitating that in a way in the years after the council, and that wasn't helpful. But that's a big topic for a whole other talk.
Absolutely. As part of the objections of the nuns that science answers everything, do you have any ideas, any thoughts on how to integrate Catholicism with science? Yeah, good. In fact, I'm developing a paper right now on that, and I think it's a hugely important issue. Here's the first observation. I think it's important always to ask meta questions because they get us closer to religion. So someone's a scientist, right? They're a physicist, a chemist, they're a astronomer, whatever. And they are so caught up in the wonders of that science, how much it can know. Well, ask the meta question, namely, why should the world be intelligible at all? So every scientist, physicist, chemist, astronomer, whoever he or she is, has to assume that the world she's going out to meet has an intelligibility or a patterned quality that corresponds to an inquiring mind. Otherwise, the science would never get off the ground. Well, where's that come from? How do you explain the radical and universal intelligibility of the world? And I think that opens the door wide to religion. Because now you're looking at, there seems to be then some kind of intelligence behind radical and universal intelligibility. And I think that's a way in to a religion-science dialogue. The best person I know on this is John Polkinghorne. I don't know if anyone remembers that name. John Polkinghorne was a high-level Cambridge particle physicist, right? High-level scientist, who at midlife left his profession to become an Anglican priest. And he's ordained an Anglican priest and then did wonderful work reconciling science and religion. Science at the highest level, particle physics, all that stuff, quantum mechanics, and linking it to religion. So read him. But one of his observations is the one I just made about radical and universal intelligibility. That's just one suggestion. Thank you. Apparently, you have a great baseball analogy for how to teach the beauty of our faith. Could you share that, please? I've used baseball in different ways. It might be, I think what they mean is if you're teaching baseball to kids, what you would never do is begin with the infield fly rule. The infield fly rule is a very particular technical rule of baseball. It's a good rule, by the way. If you understand the infield fly rule, it's good. It makes the game better. But you wouldn't dream of beginning with that, right? You begin, when I was learning baseball as a little kid, our coaches had us get down, I remember, on our knees and feel the infield and smell the grass. They wanted us to get
And then they put the moves of the game in our bodies. I mean, they taught us the basic stances, and I still could stand to the plate, in the way that they taught me to. And then they got us playing, got us hitting and running and throwing. My point is, they drew us into the beauty of the game first, right? The rhythm of it, the wonder of it, the smell and the feel, the texture of it. Then once you play for a while, you begin to understand, oh, that's why we have these rules. Oh yeah, that's cool. That rule makes sense, because if you don't do that, then the game was going to fall apart. The rules then emerge naturally and organically out of the beauty of the game. Now, here's the analogy. A mistake we make in religion is we can commence with our version of the infield fly rule. Let's commence with debating details of sexual morality. Well, that's not going to draw anyone into the game, Rather, get them into the beauty of Catholicism, and then they will eventually come to understand why we have rules, including rules about sexuality. But I wouldn't recommend beginning with those. I begin with the beauty and the rhythm and the texture of the game. I begin with the saints. I begin with the liturgy. I begin with prayer. I begin with the smell of incense. I begin with stained glass windows. You know what I'm saying? I begin with Mother Teresa's sisters taking care of the poor. And once you're into the game and you played it for a while, the rules will naturally emerge from the texture of the game. I think that's probably the analogy they're thinking of.
One person asks, do you think that fewer young people say they're religious because they're allowed to be unreligious? In the past, it was just not as accepted to be non-religious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could be. That could be. And maybe that's okay, because I don't want people to feel obligated or to be, threatened or to be browbeaten, So, okay, if you got greater range and freedom, fine. But I'll say this, too. This goes back several years. I met a lady at the parish, and she said, my son, he's about 7, we're not making him come to Mass. We're going to let him decide what he wants to do, when he comes of age. And I said to her, yeah, but would you accept that logic in any other area of life? Like, would you say, don't worry about practicing your violin, just, pick it up when you feel like it. Or, no, you don't have to go to baseball practice. Just, when you decide to go. No, I mean, we compel young people to do all kinds of things because we know that's a way it's going to enhance their lives. And if we leave everything up to freedom, we'd never experience much. We'd settle for a very low level of attainment. So I'm skeptical of it's a hyper-modern, the stress on freedom. I mean, freedom's overrated in that way. Some of the best things in my life came because I didn't have freedom. I was told to do something. And then it got into me in such a way that it made an experience possible that otherwise I wouldn't have had. So that's a little editorial on the side about too much freedom.
And speaking of freedoms and intellectual freedom in colleges, one attendee observes there's a problem in the Catholic universities. Our children go in Catholic and leave non-Catholic. Yep. They're taught values that do not align with the church teachings, especially in liberal arts and social sciences. Is this a problem? Yes.
And I'm getting too old to prevaricate on this. It is a very serious problem, and it's statistically backed up over and over again. The number of Catholics that come into Catholic universities and they disaffiliate, they lose their faith. Now, I'm not doing some blanket condemnation of all Catholic universities, but there is a disturbing statistical indication that this is true. And too many of the Catholic universities have allowed their Catholic identity to evanesce. And they've adopted much more of a secular model of education. And what's the point? My thing is, we already got Princeton, and we already got Yale and Harvard. We don't need more of those. We need truly Catholic universities that honor our own intellectual tradition. And it should bother us big time that way too many Catholics are losing their faith, even at the Catholic universities. So, yeah, that's a problem.
And I have another question from someone that she and her husband have 3 young children. They check all the boxes for church attendance, parochial school, etc., and yet they're having serious difficulty having their children baptized. They can't find people to serve as godparents because they can't get a letter from their church saying that they attend regularly. The majority of their close family and friends have left the church over the last decade.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I get that.
Why this barrier to baptism for their children?
Yeah, no, I get that. I don't have a good answer. I have to really sit down and talk to them. But I do understand that dilemma, is we're looking for godparents and looking for people to guide our young people into the faith. And that generation has become, not exclusively, but to a large degree, disaffiliated. So I get the frustration. I'm not sure I've got a really good answer to that one.
I can share some of those details with you after. In the meantime, others are asking, are there any written course materials, any information that would be good leave-behinds for this, things to study further?
Get this book. I mentioned Brandon Vaught earlier from Word on Fire. He's got a book called Return, and we just did a reissue of it. And it's all about this issue. It's written for parents and grandparents to try to bring young people back. And it's full of a lot of practical advice. You know, I would read Christian Smith to understand the phenomenon of disaffiliation. But Brandon might be helpful to, for like practical, concrete tips of how to bring people back and re-engage them.
Thank you. And also on the subject of resources, do you have something recommended that discusses the transcendental values, the good, the true, and the beautiful?
Well, the classic sources and Aquinas and people like that. But let me think. No, I can't come up with something right off the top of my head, something more accessible or more contemporary on that. Dietrich von Hildebrand, the great German phenomenologist, has a lot. That's a little bit heavy, though. Joseph Pieper, another German philosopher, who's pretty accessible. Those are a couple places to look, but I'd have to think a bit more about a more accessible text. Aquinas is the classic place to look.
Thank you. Back to schools for a moment. How great is the impact of the leftist progressive educators, I should say, of most Catholic schools from grammar to university, and their rejection of traditional Orthodox Catholic values?
Well, it does worry me, yeah. I mean, at all these different levels now, and in California, some of those moves that are still being debated, and what our schools will look like, and what curriculum will look like. Especially at the university level, there is that, I've been a critic of this kind of woke mentality, which has become so dominant in the universities. And it comes up out of a French theorizing of the last century, people like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and others, who are not exactly friends of classical Catholicism. So I get that. I mean, I think it is a worry. And, that we hold to certain objective moral values. We hold to certain epistemic values. And we do have a great intellectual tradition that bears those values. And, we should be attentive to it and not simply succumb to whatever the trendy, philosophy of the day is. So I do worry about that, yeah. And I do think it's creeping from the universities down to lower levels of education, too, in the high schools and grade schools. So, yeah, it's a worry.
And do you think, shifting gears here, do you think young people see it as hypocritical when priests are anti-abortion and yet pro-capital punishment?
Yeah, that's an incorrect position. I mean, if you really are, I'm not sure I know many priests who are against abortion but for capital punishment. No, I mean, I'm with John Paul II and Pope Francis and the Catechism that would clearly see those as, tightly related issues, both involve an attack on life. So, no, I think you're right. It would be inconsistent to be for one and not the other.
Do you think there's something missing in our catechesis to the very young in our Catholic schools?
Yeah, plenty. That's why I rail against this dumbing down of the faith. And at both the Catholic schools and the catechetical programs, yeah, there's a lot missing. I'd say the intellectual is where we're weakest. And I've been beating that drum for a long time. I think we're good at a lot of, as I say, prayer, the works of justice. We're better at that, building up community. But I think the intellectual, we are lacking in that.
And is there a way that we can communicate to all Catholics, and especially the LGBTQ, that we love and respect them, even though we don't necessarily agree with their choices?
Yeah, and we have to do it all the time. I mean, that's the basic stance we should always be in, without exception. So, how we do that, that's a good question. And I think that's a question of prudential judgment. What are the best ways to communicate the Church's care and concern and love? But absolutely, we have to do that.
And related to evangelization, how do you think COVID is affecting evangelism? And how can we get ahead of the restrictions?
Yeah, it's affecting it poorly, obviously. And one of my big worries, and I've been every meeting I've had in the Archdiocese by Zoom, I've brought this up. We were already in trouble before COVID in terms of disaffiliation. We were already in trouble with only 20% coming to Mass. Now we've had a year where people have been kind of in the practice of not going to Mass. So that worries me a lot. And I think we've got to be very proactive. My own feeling now, we should, as an archdiocese, be very proactive about getting our people to come back. I've been encouraging everyone that's still coming to our restricted, COVID Masses, make sure you're a missionary, that when we can open the doors again definitively, you bring one or two people back with you. So it's affected us negatively for sure, and we've got to be proactive missionaries in bringing people back. And the second part of that again, Bob, was what? It was a second. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm still on mute. Just getting ahead of the restrictions, and I think you touched on that already with the electronic media, the social media, the Zooms.
Yeah, and please God, this will be over. I mean, sometime soon. I've been saying that for months, but with the vaccines, I hope. And now in all of our counties here in LA, we can at least get a quarter of our people inside church. So that's a good thing. Up in my, our region here, we've not been able to do that for the past several months. So, we'll keep pressing, and I hope in a few months we'll be back.
Amen. And you mentioned, by way of social media, Reddit. Are there other online forums where we would be likely to meet young people with questions?
Well, let's see. I was sort of encouraging parishes to do it themselves. Is you set up a forum, and it's easy as what I did on Reddit, which is, I am a Catholic priest, eager to dialogue with anyone who's got a question, or, are there atheists there that would like to ask me a question? And believe me, they'll come out of the woodwork. I think you'd be very surprised that you'll attract people to it. Or, here's my sermon, or here's a review of a movie, or here's this book I'm reading, or, so I think priests and ministers in the parishes should do it. And if you don't know how to use the technology, get someone 20 or younger to teach you, and just do it. Launch out, duc in altum, go out into the depths.
And speaking of depths, where can we go to educate ourselves so that we don't dumb down our faith?
Yeah, as I say, a lot of resources available now. At the risk of self-promotion, Word on Fire is all about that. We're bringing out material both in film and in book constantly. So go on the Word on Fire site and you'll find all kinds of materials. But there are a lot of good apologetic sources today that are engaging the new atheists. A guy I really like is William Lane Craig, the evangelical philosopher who has debated Hitchens and Dawkins and all the top atheists. He's got some wonderful material. Now, I don't agree with him on every issue, but he's very good, I think, at engaging the atheists. I was just on a program, it's called Unbelievable. It's based in England, and it's hosted by an evangelical Protestant, but he always has a believer and a non-believer on his program. So I was on, it'll air, I think, in April, but I recorded it a couple weeks ago, with this young kid. He's from Oxford, super bright, Catholic, of course, who's lost his faith and is now a militant atheist. So I was on with him, and we had like a 2-hour debate. My point there is there's a lot of sites out there now that go into this whole issue of atheism and belief.
Thank you. What kind of activities can the church do to get young kids 10 and over in that age group involved in our faith in addition to just CCD classes?
Yeah, well, I don't know about the real little kids, but I mentioned the works of justice stuff is get them in trips to Appalachia, or get them working with the homeless, get them helping in soup kitchens, get them with Catholic charities. I think young people respond to that very powerfully. We have these retreats, of course, out in our region that young people, I think, find attractive. So that kind of experience, the justice business, then the prayer. And I think these lively discussions about the issues of life and death and meaning and God and science. So I think all three of those, the good, the true, and the beautiful, get them involved in justice, get them around liturgical and prayer events, get them talking and critically thinking about their faith. I think we do all those things with young kids.
And moving up just a little bit in age, one of the attendees observes it appears that many Catholic parishes do not have any ministries that cater to young adults, those up to age 30. Why is this, and how can local parishes have groups that are aimed at this demographic? And in addition, there should be ministries catering to middle age, the 30 to 50. Alas, this group doesn't seem to exist in many local parishes. What are your comments on?
Yeah, I agree, and I guess I would send the challenge out too is volunteer. You start the group. So I don't know what age the questioner is, but if someone in the parish, like in his or her 20s, talk to the pastor and you start the group. And it could be as simple as, an announcement goes out on Sunday, we're going to meet Sunday night and we're going to have a, gathering or a discussion or watch a movie or something. You start it. In terms of older people too, I've always loved the Catholic Action model, and I don't know why we dropped it after the council. Some of my great heroes in Chicago were priests involved in Catholic Action in the 50s. Which involved typically, let's get all the physicians and nurses in this parish, get them in one room. Let's break open the gospel. Let's do see, judge, and act, and see what we can do to bring the gospel to our world. Next week, bring the lawyers in. The following week, bring all the business leaders in. Next week, bring whatever group you want, and do a see, judge, and act around the gospel. Simple. But some of the best and brightest people in the Catholic Church in the 1940s and 50s were involved in Catholic Action. I revive it for people in middle age who are now in the full flight of their careers. Good. Let's get them talking about the faith. I knew a group in Chicago, all very high-powered people at a kind of a wealthy parish in the city. And these men would gather, I think, one day a week at 6:30 a.m., and they would have morning prayer together, and then they do a see, judge, and act about their work in high finance and in law and in government. And good. And if it doesn't exist, you start it. Get it organized.
Amen to that as well. Here's a question again referring to someone in the LGBTQ community. They're young. How would you advise them reconnecting with their faith when fundamentally the Catholic teachings conflict with who they feel they are as a person?
And again, these are super complicated things, and I'd much rather talk directly to somebody. But I would say simply this, is to realize that your deepest and most abiding identity is not around your sexuality, but rather around your relationship with God. That what's deepest and most abiding and most important about you is that you're a beloved child of God. And begin with that. Someone created by God, redeemed by Christ, loved all the way down because Christ went to the cross to save you. That identity is what's most fundamental and is right at the heart of the church. And it's only out of that more fundamental identity that you'll come to understand something like your sexuality. But what I would resist is the tendency to say that anyone's sexual identity is what's most basic about them. I don't think that's true. I think it's that we're a beloved child of God. That's what's most basic. And that's what the church is fundamentally addressing all the time.
Thank you. A number of questions have pointed to the media as a root of a problem with our children. Their influence, starting from school and through television, who we put them with makes a difference, and people who can influence the media. What would you say about this whole business of the influence of media versus influence of parents and peers and such?
Yeah, I mentioned Jean Twenge, this professor from San Diego, and the book called iGen. I recommend it. But she talked a lot about the correlation between screen time and depression. And I think it's very credible that we have a generation now that's so attuned to screens. And they see reality largely on screens rather than directly. And that's a problem. So you talk about the media, when I was growing up, I guess it meant television with like 4 stations. But now the media are so pervasive, and the way they draw us addictively into their influence is bad. And so I would recommend, to parents of young kids, I would keep them away from those screens as much as you can. You know what I mean? I don't mean the ones that are important for their education and so on, but I mean all these kind of addictive machines. What's that movie, Joe, remember what's the name of that movie about the addiction of iPhones and everything? The Social Dilemma, yeah. There's a movie called The Social Dilemma. I'd highly recommend parents watch it. I was fascinated by it. And it's interviewing people who are very much involved with Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and everything else. And they know they designed all these machines to be addictive. They designed them to draw us, to themselves, and how dangerous that is psychologically, and I would say spiritually. So I would say to parents, watch that movie and be wary of the amount of time your kids are spending on them. And the whole thing with teenagers and low self-esteem and the way that kind of awful culture of backbiting and critique, and when you go into com boxes and people put photos up and then they're attacked, and there's something terrible about that world. And so I'd be careful with it, wary of it in regard to kids.
Yes, that Social Dilemma is on
Social
Netflix,
Dilemma,
and that
yeah.
is a really excellent picture.
You saw it, yeah. It's quite good. I agree.
Yeah, my stepchildren that have seen it said, "Oh, we know all this stuff, but it is still shocking to see it on the screen."
Yeah.
There's also a comment, since we've heard so many negative things, from one attendee. Simple statement: they went with their UCSB granddaughter to St. Mark's last night, and so impressed with the encouragement in reaching out to the college kids.
Yeah. It's a great parish. I don't know if it was Father John Love who was there, but he's the pastor. St. Mark's, they do a wonderful job there, right? So I would hold that up too as a great model.
Yes. And another question that we haven't seen yet tonight is, how is the church evolving with Francis's study of possibly ordaining women deacons? And do you feel this would positively affect our church population? And if so, why?
I don't think it's going to happen. I just looking at, Francis has sponsored, I think, is it 2 separate groups to kind of study the question. The impression I have is that that's not going to happen. And I think it would cause trouble for our theology, because of the way episcopacy and priesthood and the diaconate are linked together, that women should be drawn more and more and more into the life and ministry and leadership of the church, absolutely. But there'd be an issue there with our understanding of the clerical state, the understanding of ordained ministry. So I think that would cause some theological issues. I like a lot how Francis is reaching out, I think, very invitingly to women and bringing them into positions of great leadership and responsibility. And I always emphasize, too, that the most important thing in the church is being a saint. And anyone, man or woman, can start being a saint tonight. You know, and saints have by far the most power in the church. We associate power with office, but that's only one very limited kind of power. The real power. Look, I mean, who was the most powerful Catholic of the 20th century? I mean, with the possible exception of John Paul II, it would have been Mother Teresa of Calcutta. I think say that without hesitation. She was the most powerful, influential Catholic of the 20th century. Of the 19th century, the Little Flower probably, or Bernadette of Lourdes. You know, so it's the saints. That's where it's happening, not so much in office.
And there's a question around, it's not always our nuns that are the issue. Many Christian churches pull in our young people and show them the beautiful.
Yeah.
COVID, meantime, has highlighted where our own parish liturgies, homilies, and services have been lacking now that we can mass hop as the virtual front pew. How can we help our parishes to understand how important our worship is to our youth?
Yeah, it is. And I could have given you a lot more quotes tonight of disaffiliated people who still remember the Mass very fondly. And the mystical experiences they had, the beauty of the Mass, the community they experienced there. So I quite agree with that. We should be very attentive to music, to homilies, to the beauty of our liturgies, absolutely. On the question of disaffiliation and non-Christian churches, it's interesting, they've studied that. Some disaffiliate into more evangelical Christian churches. Fewer disaffiliate into mainstream Protestant, but the overwhelming majority disaffiliate into the ranks of the nuns. So it is some indeed go into other, Christian churches, but the overwhelming majority become nuns. They become unaffiliated. So I think that's where we should put our main attention. But I quite agree with the point about the liturgy. Absolutely right.
And can you comment, please, on how we can go about handling this cancel culture?
Oh, I hate cancel culture. And I've been writing a lot recently about, I mentioned wokeism. I hate that whole approach. And its roots are in very dubious philosophical perspectives. But one of the ugliest faces of wokeism, I think, is the cancel culture. I just wonder, I mean, who are these perfect people that never think or do anything wrong, that have the right to eliminate someone for making, a faux pas or saying the wrong thing? And see, it's born too of an antagonistic social theory. Now, the roots of that are back in Nietzsche and people like that. And they're behind a lot of the woke perspective. Catholic social teaching is not an antagonistic social theory. But when you've got an antagonistic social theory that rests upon the us against them, think of Marxism. I mean, it's trying to foment social warfare, the warfare of classes and so on. But when you have an antagonistic social theory, the cancel culture becomes one of its flowerings, and it's particularly terrible. I think we have to resist it. The problem is that even though I think stats show something like 85% of Americans hate the cancel culture, but yet we're also afraid of it, that we succumb to it. I think the cancel culture people are like bullies, and most bullies are cowards, and when you stand up to them, they back down. And I think as a culture, though, we've been bullied. And we should realize strength in our numbers, and we should stand up to bullies and not cave into them. Anyway, that's a talk for another day too.
Indeed, and the issue of Harry Potter books, they were very popular, and the films, and there were incantations in them. Is there some way that we can properly counsel our children on the reading of those books? Yeah,
I can't comment. I just don't know them. I know a lot of people who are great defenders of the Harry Potter books, but I must say I just have never read them, so I can't say.
Then we'll stick with the social dilemma.
Yeah.
There have been several questions